Everyone. Thank you so much for waking up early on this Thursday morning. I don't know if you're getting thunder by your house, but I'm getting thunder by my house. And it's already rained a bit this morning. But I'm excited to begin this 4-week course together as we get ready in a few weeks to get to our nation's 244th birthday. And as I was thinking about what we might want to talk about in the month of late June, early July, I thought about the interesting history of Jews in America. And there are obviously a lot of collections that have been put together. Some of the more famous ones, certainly Jonathan Sarna's American Judaism is one that really takes a story through. But what I like to do, what I wanted to do in this and what we're going to do together is do history in a different way. When I was in high school and in the AP US history course, which I think they're still teaching year after year, thing that, and maybe you have children or grandchildren who took this course, the thing that was the big fearful thing at the end of the year, what was called the DBQ, the document-based question. It was part of the AP exam. It was the major essay at the end of the exam. And in the document-based question, the exam would give you 6 or 7 primary sources, and they could be essays or articles or charts or graphs or political cartoons, but they were primary sources from a particular period. And then they would ask an essay question. And using the information that you could glean from the primary sources and whatever knowledge you had in your head, you were supposed to answer the question and how and you would be graded on that. But ever since I went through that experience as a junior in high school, and my really phenomenal U.S. history teacher that year, Jonathan Meyer, had us for our final exam of the year. He had us choose a moment in U.S. history and create our own DBQ. We had to pull the primary sources and then formulate a question that we would have to then answer as our final exam. I love the idea of looking at primary sources. And so while I titled this course Moments in American Jewish History, really what I could have called it is Primary Sources in American Jewish History. But that doesn't have the same ring to it on an email from the temple or on the website. So when we talk about moments, what we're going to look at over the next 4 weeks are a series of primary sources, a series of documents that demonstrate something about what's going on in American history. And we'll talk about them, and I'll share some context. But I also, want to make this interactive so we can ask ourselves as we read these documents, what do we think they meant in their moments, and what do they mean to us today? It's kind of the same thing that we do when we read Torah, right? We read Torah, which is itself a primary document, and we ask ourselves the question, what do we think the Torah is trying to teach us with its verses? And then we ask ourselves, and what do we learn from it in this moment? So we're going to look at over the next 4 weeks 4 different periods in American history and a collection of documents from each of them. And we're going to begin today in the colonial and revolutionary period. We're going to look next week at some documents from the Civil War. We'll look 2 weeks from now at the turn of the century, focusing mostly on immigration and leading into World War II. And then look at a couple of contemporary documents from the 70s to today to give us a sense of what's going on in American Jewish community. Obviously, the closer we get to modern time, the harder it is to do history, right? Most historians say you need at least 30 to 50 years to be even doing history, but we can play around a little bit. We're not going to do stuff from the 21st century. It's just too complicated to get some sense of context. But I have some ideas from the 70s, 80s, and 90s that I think would be interesting for us to discuss. So, do I have all of your faces? I have all of the faces, I think, of people. I'm going to encourage everyone. We are going to make this interactive. So if you give me one moment, I do want to pull up my chat so I have it here in case people have. So if you have a question or want to interrupt the conversation, by all means, use the chat to get my attention or wave your arms like this on the screen if you have your camera on. This is meant to be more of a discussion and less of a lecture. Okay? Any questions before we get started? All right. Yeah, Lorraine. Lorraine, you're on mute. You got to unmute yourself. Can you put it in the chat? Can you type it into the chat? All right, Lorraine, 1 second. I'm gonna see it. I'm gonna click a button. You're gonna get a pop-up saying unmute yourself. Click yes or okay. All right, Lorraine, we're going to have to move forward, but in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen is your microphone. If you can find a way to get your mic on, we'll continue. But I'm gonna move. Oh, there you go. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. What's the question? That was my question.
Okay, good. Moving forward. All right. So today, focusing on the colonial and revolutionary period, we're going to look at 3 different episodes that happened in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. So one is from the colonial period, one is right around the time of the revolution, and one is right after. And those are an incident that happened with the Dutch West India Company in the 1650s. Those of you from New York will understand this a little bit better than those of us not from New York. We're going to look at the exchange between the newly inaugurated President Washington and the Newport Hebrew Synagogue, the Torah Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. And we're going to look at what went on just about 15 years later when Napoleon took over in France after the revolution there and what he was thinking about towards his Jewish community. And we're going to use these to compare and contrast what was going on in America and what was going on in Europe at the same time. Okay? Here we go. First document. From in the Dutch West India Company, Peter Stuyvesant. We know from Stuyvesant, he seems like he was a great man, but not so much, right? Brian shaking his head, Philip shaking his hand, good, right? So here's the bit of context. In September of 1654, 23 or so Jewish refugees came to New Amsterdam from a city in Brazil known as Recife. Now, we got to think about the context for a moment. Brazil, which was part of the Portuguese kingdom, under rule of the Portuguese. The Portuguese had a tenuous relationship with the Jewish community, the Portuguese crown. There had been expulsions and all of that. But we also know that Amsterdam was also under control of the Portuguese at various times, right? We know, for example, that a lot of the Jews left Iberia, Spain, and Portugal and went to Amsterdam. So there was a Portuguese expat community in Amsterdam, and so there's like all of this sort of like kinship, kind of kinsman thing going on between Amsterdam and New Amsterdam and Brazil. So it would make sense that Jews from Brazil who felt like they had to leave from Brazil might think that going to New Amsterdam under the control of the Dutch West India Company might be a safe landing space because of the relationship between the Netherlander Jewish community, the Portuguese Jewish community, and the Brazilian Jewish community. What they didn't think about was Peter Stuyvesant, right? And what his attitude might be if 23 Jewish refugees or thereabouts were to land in New Amsterdam. So these refugees come to New Amsterdam in September, and they are greeted with this letter, which Stuyvesant sent to the Dutch West India Company, who had chartered New Amsterdam. And he wrote this: "The Jews who have arrived would nearly all like to remain here, but learning that they, with their customary usury and deceitful trading with the Christians, were very repugnant to the inferior magistrates, as also to the people having the most affection for you. The deaconry also fearing that owing to their present indigence, they might become a charge in the coming winter. We have, for the benefit of this weak and newly developing place and the land in general, deemed it useful to require them in a friendly way to depart, praying also most seriously in this connection for ourselves as also for the general community of your worships, that the deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ, be not allowed to further infect and trouble this new colony, to the detraction of your worships and the dissatisfaction of your worships' most affectionate subjects. Very truly yours, P. Stuyvesant. He seemed to enjoy the refugees arriving in New York, no? Right. Clearly, Peter Stuyvesant had some hostility towards the Jewish community. And what's really interesting about this is it seems like these refugees were the first Jews, in Stuyvesant's knowledge, to be on the island of New Amsterdam, right? He was bringing to this preconceived notions about Jews, not even, let's call it, poorly fact-based prejudice, right? It wasn't like there were Jews in New Amsterdam that he was responding to their behavior and saying, listen, if we bring more in, it's just going to make the problem worse. What he's saying is Jews, by definition, have problems, right? Just to keep the conversation going, what are some of the problems that Stuyvesant recognizes that Jews might bring? And I'll invite you to either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and chime in.
They lend money at usurious rates.
Right, so the usury piece of it, right? And that's a well-known anti-Semitic trope that comes out of Christianity that's important to contextualize, right? In medieval Christianity, what interest rate was considered to be usury? Alan, you're on mute if you're trying to chime in.
Anything above zero.
Anything above zero, exactly, right? Lending with any kind of interest was considered by the church in this period to be usury, right?
But we grew up with 6% being anything above that was usury in the United States.
Right. And so forgetting where the numbers are, because in Christianity it was anything above zero, how did Jews get the reputation of being usurious?
The British permitted the Jews to lend money. That was why they could stay in the United Kingdom and in England.
So that's one of many examples, right? Here was the problem. As Christendom was coming out of the dark period, out of the Middle Ages, and trying to and moving forward in building in having communities become city-states and city-states become kingdoms, if you're trying to expand and develop, what do you need? Financing. You need financing, right? The Jews of the Middle Ages tended to be much more liquid, right? They held on to their possessions of gold and silver more so than grounding themselves in real estate and land for two reasons. One, no one would sell them land, and the land that they could get their hands on was worthless because it was outside the town wall, so it was unsafe. And two, had been expelled from everywhere we had ever been, we tended to keep ourselves pretty liquid, right? Pretty nimble. We had all of our values we kept in physical possessions that we could in the middle of the night very quickly gather up and take with us. And so we held our wealth in gold and silver more than in other possessions, so we could bring it with us. The third piece of the puzzle is that Jews in France and Jews in Germany and Jews in Poland and Jews in Amsterdam and Jews in Spain had a common language, right? They each had functionality in Hebrew, right? Functionally enough so that interstate or interlinguistic commerce could be effectuated by the Jewish community, because they could converse with each other by the written word in a way that they could, do documents and contracts and exchanges, because they could converse with each other. So when you have the community of Christianity of Western Europe trying to build itself out of the dark period, out of the Middle Ages, needing financing and lending to borrow money to invest in itself, knowing that Christianity forbade usury above 0.00%, the Jewish community became a really important resource for Christians who were willing to make that leap into building a relationship with the Jews. And all over Europe, that's what happened. Initially, you'd have what I would consider to be progressive, forward-thinking Christian leaders who would begin this financial relationship with the Jewish community, and it was done with positivity. It was done with the sense of, you're going to help us and we're going to help you. The Jews would get a little bit of protection from the local king or whatever it was in exchange for the financing, and it went well for a while, until the Christian community grew big enough that they could stand on their own 2 feet. And they would often do one of 2 or 3 things. They would say to the Jews, you know what, we're not going to pay you back anymore, right? We don't need this anymore. We're too powerful. We're going to stop paying you back. Or we're going to expel you so you can't collect on the deed. And we're going to start telling everyone that the fact that you tried to collect on the debt that you lent us in good faith, we're going to accuse you of usury. And that happened in multiple places around Europe. Those were some of the feelings. Brian, go ahead.
Merchant of Venice.
Exactly. So that was the attitude toward Jews that Stuyvesant is playing on here, right? They are usurious and they are deceitful, right? By deceitful means they actually want you to pay back the debts you've borrowed from them, right? How awful that is. Now, are there and were there deceitful Jewish lenders? Of course, right? And there are today. But the idea that it's built into being Jewish is obviously an anti-Semitic diatribe. But when you come from a culture that sees lending for interest as a sin, as Christianity did, it makes it very easy to say, but those people, those godless people, those people who committed deicide, they don't understand from this, and we should keep our distance from them, right? That sense of repugnancy, right, that he refers to. So one of it is the usurious nature of this. What's another thing that Stuyvesant is concerned about with having no evidence for?
Blasphemers and all that kind of stuff. It's about the Jesus thing.
Yeah, Philip's right. There's a part of it which is they're Jews. Jews are blasphemous to Christians, right? Jews don't believe in God, right? Meaning Jesus, right? So there's that whole piece of it, which is we're trying to build a Christian nation here in New Amsterdam. Amsterdam is Christian. The Dutch West India Company is Christian. I'm Christian. We're all Christian here. Why should we have Jews in? They are blasphemers. Good. There's something else in the middle of this, which is a common conversation, even in today's time, around refugees and why they should be turned away.
They won't be able to provide for themselves. They're going to be a dole on the society.
Exactly, right? We see it right here, right? For their present indigence, that would become a charge in the coming winter, right? He's fearful that these refugees might have nothing and become a public charge, right? We'd have to sustain them. I point because as we see in the response from the Dutch West India Company, that was a thing that they were concerned as well, right? So we see all of these things, and then we get this language that we're seeing. It seems like something that Stephen Miller might say, right? Which is further infect and trouble this new colony, right? This notion of an infection, of vermin, right? We see that anti-Semitic trope coming over and over and over again. It's not just coming from, this is 350 years before Nazi Germany, but we're seeing some of that language here as well, right? And by the way, language used about all others, not just Jews, but in 17th century Amsterdam, the Jews were the other of the moment to play with. So we have Peter Stuyvesant imploring the Dutch West India Company, who grants the charter for New Amsterdam and to whom he is responsible. And what's interesting is that Peter Stuyvesant is described by historians as having autocratic tendencies, but was obedient to his employer, right? And we see that here. He wants to tell everyone what's what and be the one in charge, but he knows that he's answerable to his employer, the Dutch West India Company. And here is how they reply. We would have liked to effectuate and fulfill your wishes. Can you hear me? We would have liked to effectuate and fulfill your wishes and request that the new territory should no more be allowed to be infected by people of the Jewish nation. For we foresee therefrom the same difficulties which you fear. But after having further weighed and considered the matter, we observe that this would be somewhat unreasonable and unfair, especially because of the considerable loss sustained by this nation with others in the taking of Brazil, and also because of the large amount of capital which they still have invested in the shares of this company. Therefore, after many deliberations, we have finally decided and resolved to apostille upon a certain petition presented by said Portuguese Jews, that these people may travel and trade to and in New Netherland and live and remain there, provided the poor among them shall not become a burden to the company or to the community, but be supported by their own nation. You will now govern yourself accordingly. What do they say?
The investors in the company are Jewish, and
Yeah.
Jews will take care of their other fellow Jews.
Yes. So there's a piece of that, which is that both the Dutch West India Company itself had Jewish investors, and the Amsterdam Jewish community had a good relationship with the Dutch West India Company beyond the financial piece of it. So there was a lot of sense of these are people who have been good to us and continue to be good to us. Brian.
Yeah, but historically, understand what's going on with the Dutch West India Company. They are losing their influence in Asia, and the Portuguese are driving them out. Trading is now starting to be done by the Portuguese rather than the Dutch. They're losing it all over the world. They're talking about Brazil, and of course, Brazil is now being colonized by the Portuguese. And
Yeah.
this is a difficulty that is happening in New Amsterdam.
Yes. And who have been good and loyal partners in the mercantilist undertaking in New Amsterdam and in Brazil?
The Ashkenazi, the Sephardic Jews,
People.
the Jews who left
These people.
Spain and Portugal and went to Brazil and places of that sort, and to Canada and New York too, because we see that many at Sephardim who are not Ashkenazi trace their origins to Amsterdam, of all places.
But even that Amsterdam origin, Brian, is secondary. Those are the Sephardi Jews who fled to Amsterdam in the 15th century after the expulsion.
And they become the grandees as opposed to our crowd.
Right. That's and the prime example, the leading thinker of Amsterdam, of Netherland Jews of this period, Spinoza. Right.
And in this country, Belmont.
Exactly. Philip.
They're the ones who I think established the Spanish Portuguese synagogue in Central Park West, which is called Shirat Israel. Shirat means remnants, I think, doesn't it? Remnants of Israel.
Shara is gates.
Oh, Shirat.
So the Sha'ar is either left.
I thought it was remnants. I'm sorry, but for some reason I thought it was remnants. But anyway, that's where they were. They were very wealthy. It's a very wealthy temple.
So Sha'ar with an aleph is remnant, and Sha'ar with an ayin is a gate.
It was remnants. Yeah, that's what it means. And on this, the big synagogue on Central Park West, it's still there.
Yeah.
They call their rabbis ministers, by the way, which I think is very funny.
If you look at the Union Prayer Book, it says minister, right? And you look at newspaper articles of my colleagues from the teens and 20s, the Reverend Moshe Solomonov, right? And they wore Cossacks, and they wore all this, right? So we have the Dutch West India Company say to Stuyvesant, basically, Stuyvesant, eat your hat, right? Except not really. Because what they say is, listen, we agree. right? We agree that these people are not the best people to have around, but we have to, right? They're juiced in. Their people are our investors. They've been good partners to us. And so while we understand that you're concerned about what it's like to have these vermin living amongst you for reasons of finance and for reasons of money, basically, we have to keep them around. They're a necessary evil. It's the cost of doing business, so to speak. And even the one pragmatic question, right, which is what do we do if they go on the dole? They make very clear what Stuyvesant's allowed to do, right? If there are Jews who become public charges, is New Amsterdam responsible to take care of them as they are other subjects? Nope. 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 Which is difficult, and we'll see this last piece, right? So this comes a year later, and just to give you a bit of the timing, we'll go back real quick. So Stuyvesant writes in September of 1654. The reply comes 7 months later in April of 55. And then a full year later, on March 13th of 56, we get this other decree from the Dutch West India Company, which says, the consent given to the Jews to go to New Netherland, and they are to enjoy the same liberty that is granted them in this country, was extended with respect to civil and political liberties, without the said Jews becoming thereby entitled to a license to exercise and carry on their religion in synagogues or gatherings. So long, therefore, there's no request presented to you, Stuyvesant, to allow such a free exercise of religion. Any consideration relative thereto is too premature. And when later something shall be presented about it, you will be doing well to her for the matter to us in order to await thereon the necessary orders. What is this saying? Well, in 1655, in October, Stuyvesant wrote to the Dutch West India Company asking whether or not he had to give religious liberty to the Jewish community. And it's not really clear from this letter, I don't think, what they're saying. They get civil and political liberties. They can't be locked up just for being Jewish. But do they get to right to worship on their own? When we read this, Alan, I'm looking at you. Counselor?
Let's put it this way. It says my guess is what they're saying is they can pray in private, but they can't get together, which is kind of the antithesis of the Jewish concept of being together for prayer.
Right. Or they can't build houses of worship, right? By the way,
they can't have gatherings either, whatever that means.
Whatever that means, right. This is, I've read this thing 17 times, and it's in a book, and I can't figure out what it means. Right?
I think it means that they have to abide by this and not have gatherings or temple until such time that they become really upset about not being able to do their thing. And then Stuyvesant has to present it to the Dutch West Indies Company before he does anything to decide what they are going to do after that. As long as they're okay and they don't demand anything, we'll just let it be. Let sleeping dogs lie. But if they decide they want something, we'll all have to talk about it over here.
You know, and I think what it also might mean, Bob, I think you're on the right track, is that what the Dutch West India Company is not doing is giving Stuyvesant permission to say no, right? He is forbidden from outlawing, right? He doesn't have to necessarily grant them permission, but they have told him that he does not have the authority to outlaw the construction of a synagogue or to outlaw public gatherings of Jews, which, knowing where his attitudes are, is a step in a certain direction.
So it all depends on money.
Yeah.
All money.
When the question comes up, we'll see where our investors are in that moment, right? Maybe by then the Jews of Amsterdam will have divested themselves from the Dutch West India Company, and we can say, yeah, no, you can discriminate against them. Or maybe by then there'll be more Jews invested and will want to be better partners to this. I think the story is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that when you study the history of Jews in different parts of the world, and when you study particularly the Jewish experience in America, one of the things that differentiates America from the rest of the world is that America has no history of Jewish disenfranchisement, right? From the moment of the founding, and we'll get to that in a moment when we get to the founding, Jews have always been as politically free as the rest of the nation to participate in the civic responsibilities and to exercise their religion. This is about as far as it gets in American Jewish history in preventing Jews from exercising their religion. And it's almost 150 years before the Constitution is passed, this 140 some odd years, 30 some odd years before it's passed. And even there's a tension there. Stuyvesant tried to keep Jews out of civic life in America, but his authorities said, no, you can't do it. I also think it's funny because when I think of the story of Stuyvesant in New Amsterdam, I think of the parallel of Addison Meisner in Boca Raton, right? We know that Addison Meisner was a rabid anti-Semite, and he tried to keep Jews out of Boca Raton, and it kept that attitude for a while. But here we are today, right? Almost 100 years later. How many, raise your hand if you live in a neighborhood that's named Addison something or Meisner something, right? All over the place, right? And crawling with Jews, right? To use that unfortunate pun, right?
Crawling is not a good word.
Use it intentionally. Right? Think about that, and then you think about New Amsterdam, right? If there's one community that has a stronger Jewish community than Boca Raton, it might be New York. I'm not even sure it is, but it might be New York. In the same way that I joke all the time that Addison Meisner is rolling over in his grave, I think that Peter Stuyvesant must be as well, knowing that New Amsterdam became such a powerful Jewish community, not just in America, but really in the world. Jack.
I think the interesting thing to me is that in 1497, actually, when the Portuguese forced Jews into conversion, and at this time, Portugal basically owned Amsterdam. Amsterdam finally gets its independence. Jews move there, and they go from being conversos to back to Judaism. The reason why, when they had to leave Recife, is when the Portuguese retook Brazil and the Inquisition aspects came into being. At least in America, they may have not disliked them, but the Inquisition was not part of the penalty.
Right. And the different milieu of church authority and sovereign authority and the charter authority. Like if you're in America, right, you're clearly not under the authority of the Catholic Church in the way that you were in Spain or Portugal or even Brazil. You're not under the same civic authority, right? And then you have this Dutch West India Charter, which creates this whole other quasi-governmental authority that really clearly Stuyvesant isn't asking, he's not writing to the bishop, he's not writing to the Pope, he's writing to the charter company, because they ultimately, as this independent corporation, have most of the authority on the island of New Amsterdam. Very different than what we saw in Recife or what we saw in certainly in Portugal or even in Amsterdam. And that sort of backwater, wasteland, wilderness, political wilderness of the New World is in some ways what allowed for the Jewish community to be able to root itself here so well and grow in the way that it did. That it wasn't, the lands here were not answerable to those other authorities in the same way. Not to mention, it took forever for that authority to be exercised, right? Remember, Stuyvesant writes in September of 54, he has to wait 7 months to get an answer, and then another year for another one. Like you can't exercise authority like that because you got to wait for the boat to cross the ocean. And that allows for certain things to happen organically in this land that you couldn't do as easily in Europe. We're going to fast forward now 140 years, 135 years. The warden of what now known as Toro Synagogue was then known as the Hebrew Congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. I had always thought this was an exchange of letters. It wasn't an exchange of letters. Washington actually went there. It was a greeting. Washington came to the synagogue on August 17th, 1790. And so Moshe Sextus had written this letter or this statement in preparation of his arrival that was read. To the President of the United States, Sir, permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you with the most cordial affection and esteem for your person and merits, and to join with our fellow citizens in welcoming you to Newport. With pleasure, we reflect those days of difficulty and danger, when the God of Israel, who delivered David from the peril of the sword, shielded your head in the day of battle. And we rejoice to think that in the same spirit who rested in the bosom of the greatly beloved Daniel, enabling him to preside over the provinces of the Babylonish Empire, rest and ever will rest upon you, enabling you to discharge the arduous duties of chief magistrate in these United States. Deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty, disposer of all events, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship, deeming every one of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal parts of the great governmental machine. This is ample and extensive federal union whose basis is philanthropy, mutual confidence, and public virtue. We cannot but acknowledge to be the work of the great God, who ruleth in the armies of heavens and among the inhabitants of the earth, doing whatever seemeth him good. For all these blessings of civil and religious liberty which we enjoy under an equal and benign administration, we desire to send up our thanks to the Ancient of Days, the great preserver of men, beseeching him that the angel who conducted our forefathers through the wilderness into the promised land may graciously conduct you through all the difficulties and dangers of this mortal life. And when, like Joshua, full of days and full of honor, you are gathered to your fathers, may you be admitted to the heavenly paradise to partake in the water of life and the tree of immortality. Done and signed by order of the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, August 17th, 1790. The allusions that he makes in one sentence, Washington is David and Daniel and Joshua all at once, which makes some sense, right? This man who came out of the military, who at various points in his life was not the most successful military man. Washington's early career was not the strongest, and only later did he rise to prominence and to be the general of the Continental Army. And there were times when it seemed like only with divine intervention was he able to be successful. And so it wasn't surprising that it seemed that many thought that the founding of our nation, that the victory of the Continental Army against the British was somehow divinely ordained, because it had to have been an act of God that allowed for it to happen. And a lot of similarities that we see in the story of our people, deliverance from God and the ability to come through and create a nation in the promised land. There's a lot of similarities that are being played with here in comparing President Washington to not quite Moses, but everybody else in the Bible. Daniel, David, and Joshua in many ways. What do we see here? What observations do you all see?
He's appealing to their mutuality, what they have in common.
Yeah. Yeah. And what do we have in common? Bobby, what is that? What other things they have in common?
Well, they're letting people come in. There's no persecution. They're giving everybody freedom of conscience and liberty and citizenship. Everyone, no matter what nation who comes there, can partake of the government. Just like what we have now.
Exactly. Exactly.
The original pilgrims that came over kind of considered themselves similar to the Israelites leaving Egypt and crossing through the Dead Sea, similar to the same actions that were happening to them, essentially leaving a form of slavery, coming to a new land where they could practice their religion and be free.
There's no question that the founders of our nation really deeply appreciated the story of the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible, right? In the way that Jack just alluded to, that it started with the pilgrims coming over, but this message of seeking our own destiny in the promised land, seeking freedom to be who we are, resonated a lot with the founding fathers. And the religiosity of the founding fathers is an interesting topic for another day. But what it seems like is a sort of very low grade Protestantism, right? That God is wonderful, and a little bit of Jesus here and there. But more than that, it's the story of the people seeking their own destiny, and with the help of God, achieving their destiny, that you see resonating with Washington and with Adams and with Franklin and with Jefferson. That it doesn't surprise that you would see the Jewish community say, like, we are those people that you all as white Christian early founders are resonating with. We are the descendants of that people. And so there is that mutuality in all of this. And of course, we see that not just in the letter from the Jewish community to Washington, but we see it also in his response. Philip, go ahead.
I believe, I could be wrong, but I think the founding fathers of Benjamin Franklin, all those people, were theists. They didn't really recognize themselves as Christian necessarily. I mean, it's my understanding. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I am.
So they talked about it, but you're right. It was it's sort of like a low level, like everybody was Christian, right? Because that's just what everybody was, and they were Protestant. They weren't Catholic, mostly Anglican, right? They came over from the Church of England, but they weren't fervent religious. They believed in God. And they were like, yeah, God, and however you understand God is good enough for me, kind of a thing. And so, that's very, very different than what we see. Very different than the Pilgrims, right, who were fervent Protestants and really zealots in many ways. So that had been tempered down, and they're not the same type of Christianity that we see, particularly today in the religious right, which are fervent. Philip, you're absolutely right. They were like, yeah, God is good, and however you access God, leave me alone. So here's Washington's response. Gentlemen, while I receive with much satisfaction your address, replete with expressions of esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that I shall always retain grateful remembrance of the cordial welcome I experienced on my visit to Newport from all classes of citizens. The reflection on the days of difficulty and danger which are past is rendered the more sweet from a consciousness that they are succeeded by days of uncommon prosperity and security. If we have wisdom to make the best use of the advantages with which we are now favored, we cannot fail, under the just administration of a good government, to become a great and happy people. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that enjoy the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. It would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I am pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of all the other inhabitants, while in every one shall sit safely under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness upon our paths, and make all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way, everlasting happy. G. Washington. Jack.
I have to unmute you.
I kind of looked at this and I always thought that George Washington's talk to the people of Providence had to do with the financial backing of the Jews in the Caribbean. One of them was, I guess, Chaim Solomon, who gave a lot of money to this movement, but they also had developed fast-moving ships that they were traded, and they were bringing in arms from Europe. They were bringing arms into the Caribbean, which were then taken to Washington's troops. And I think that all of this may not have to do with accepting them for the religious benefits of it, but in thanking them for their financial support in his war against Britain.
So, Jack, you bring up some really interesting points, and you're right. I mean, Chaim Solomon and some of the financial backing of the revolution certainly played into this. But I would push back on one thing that you said. I don't think that Washington necessarily felt that any one particular religious group was of it in itself a benefit to the society. I don't think he was saying it's good that we have Jews here. I think what he was saying is it doesn't matter what you are, right? If you want to come and contribute to this society, then we're happy to have you, right? It's a sort of it's a different mentality, right? What I think you see in the Dutch West India Company is the struggle, which is that, we wish we could keep the Jews out, but they offer us a pragmatic benefit. And so we have to get over ourselves and our animus towards them, because in the long run, it's better for us, or at least in the short term, it's going to be better for us to allow them because of what they do for us. And I think what Washington does in this statement is relieve that burden, right? Which is to say, you are not going to be judged necessarily on how much money you give to us, and we're not going to hold your religiosity against you. You want to come and do the job of a citizen in this country, we're happy to have you irrespective of your religiosity. It's not going to be held against you, and it's not going to be considered an added benefit, right? Let every, and you know, the allusion to the vine and fig tree, by the way, from the prophet Jeremiah, everyone shall sit safely under his own vine and fig tree. That's it. You do you, I do me, and we're all in this together.
Do you think that he would have done this if he didn't have the financial support that he got for his army? I don't think so.
I don't have a way to answer that question. It's a good question. I'm not denying the question. It's hard to know. It's hard to know. But
it is of interest that Chaim Solomon's family have tried to recoup some of the money that their great-grandfather or whoever it was gave. It was supposedly a loan, and I think it's still in court.
Well, if it was a loan, right? But what I also like about this is the beginning part where you can sort of see Washington's sense of being flattered. Like, thank you so much for, you know, for the praise you offer, but, you know, I'm just a citizen too, right? Right, yeah, we did this together, but most importantly, that we're a nation, right? I receive with much satisfaction. I will always be grateful. It was difficult. And it sounds like the stories of the Israelites, right? We were in difficulty and danger, and we got through to times of prosperity and security. Even in his response, he alludes to that. We'll only have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure we get to this last piece. At the same time of the American Revolution, we know that the French Revolution was going on as well. And the French Revolution had similar expressions of welcomingness to the Jewish community. But we know that the French Revolution didn't last very long. And so within a lifetime, not even a lifetime, right? 1806. So past Washington, but certainly during the lives of Jefferson and Adams, for example, we have Napoleon Bonaparte, who comes as Emperor of the French. And Napoleon had some questions. He gathers an assembly of Jewish notables in France, and he asks of them some very pointed questions. And it's going to be difficult for me to read this because, well, it's disgusting. And here's what he writes. On the report which has been made to us, that in many of the northern departments of our empire, certain Jews, following no other profession than that of usurers, have by the accumulation of the most enormous interests reduced many husbandmen of these districts to the greatest distress. We have thought it incumbent upon us to lend our assistance to those of our subjects whom rapacity may have reduced to these hard extremities. These circumstances have at the same time pointed out to us the urgent necessity of reviving among individuals of the Jewish persuasion residing in our dominions sentiments of civil morality, which unfortunately have been stifled in many of them by the abject state in which they have long languished, and which it is not our intention either to maintain or renew. To carry this design into execution, we have determined to call together an assembly of the principal Jews and to make our intentions known to them by commissioners whom we shall name for that purpose, and who shall at the same time collect their opinions as to the means they deem the fittest to reestablish among their brethren the exercise of mechanical acts and useful professions, in order to replace by an honest industry the shameful resources to which many have then resorted from generation to generation, these many centuries. To this end, on the report of our Grand Judge, Minister of Justice, and our Minister of the Interior, our Council of State being heard, we have decreed and do decree as follows. There is a suspension for 1 year from the date of the present decree of all executions of judgment and bond obligations, except so far as to prevent limitation, obtained against husbandmen not traders, in the departments of Le Sarre, L'Aurore, Montarabe, my French is terrible, these places, wherever the bonds entered into these by husbandmen are in favor of Jews. There shall be formed by the 15th of July next, in our good city of Paris, an assembly of the individuals professing of the Jewish religion and residing in the French territory. The members of this assembly, of the number fixed on the annex list, shall be from chosen in the departments named therein, and nominated by prefects from among the rabbis, the landholders, and other Jews, the most distinguished by their integrity and their justice. In the departments of our empire not mentioned in the aforesaid table, and where men of the Jewish persuasion should reside, to the number of 100 and less than 500, the prefect may name a deputy of one every 500, and of higher number up to 1,000, he may name 4 deputies, and so on. The deputies shall be named in Paris before the 10th of July, and shall send notice of their arrival and their place in the residence to the secretaries of our Minister of the Interior, who shall acquaint them of the place, day, and honor of their meeting. Our Minister of the Interior is charged with the execution of the decree. When Napoleon wants to grab hold of the entire Jewish community of France, so he can have his way with them, so he can bend them to his will. And what he does with this collection, I'm going to read a little bit of it, because here is what he asks of the Jewish notables. He gathers them the year later on July the 15th and asks them some of these questions. Is it lawful for Jews to marry more than one wife? Is divorce allowed? Can a Jewess marry a Christian, or a Jew a Christian woman? In the eyes of Jews, are Frenchmen considered as brethren or strangers? What does their law prescribe towards Frenchmen not of their religion? Do Jews born in France is treated by law as French citizens? Are they considered French? Are they bound to France? Are they bound to obey the laws? What kind of police jurisdiction have the rabbis among the Jews? Are there forms of elections of the rabbinates? And what is their police jurisdiction? Are there professions from which Jews are prohibited? Does the law prohibit the Jews from taking usury from their brethren? Does it forbid or allow usury toward strangers? Very different in France than what we see in the US, right? The Constitution, Washington as president says, Jews, you're going to live your life according to the laws of America. And as long as you follow those laws, you can do and exercise your religion however you want. Napoleon brings a much, much greater skepticism, that distrust that he sees based a lot in financial, right? The notion that there are Jews who have taken advantage of French people. And what that really means is that Frenchmen and Jews entered into a contract. The French side was not able to uphold its end of the contract or felt that the contract didn't do for him what he wanted, and now they want out, right? Because of whatever terms of the contract that became untenable or unsatisfactory to the French community, right? Clearly it was the Jews' fault, Napoleon says, right? If you go back to the beginning of the letter or of the statement, when he says, where was it? This notion that, no other profession of usurers, accumulation of enormous interest reduced them to great distress. It means they couldn't pay their debts. And that's the lender's fault. We see the same attitude from 150 years earlier. Peter Stuyvesant come back to life in early 19th century France in the eyes of Napoleon. It's difficult to look at and to read. Any comments? Any wonderings? Is that Jack's hand or Bobby's hand? I can't tell.
Well, it's funny. I'd just like to ask I don't know if this is a story made up, but many of the Jews didn't innately have a lot of money. They were able to borrow money from a bank, which would charge them 30% interest. And then were able to loan money to churches and all the rest at 40% interest. But they also borrowed money to be able to then lend it.
Yeah.
That's not mentioned much. The feeling of many is that these Jews had accumulated all this money on their own and had it all banked, but they were actually able to borrow money from local banks at a very high interest to then re-loan it to the community at a little higher interest.
So Jack, your question raises something else that I think is really important in this dynamic, which is whether or not a government or an authority treats the Jewish community as a single body or as individuals. We see both in Stuyvesant and in Napoleon and Bonaparte this notion that the Jews are doing X, Y, and Z. The Jews are wealthy. The Jews are public charges. And even in this, right, like some Jews were lending, some Jews were wealthy, some Jews were not, right? And what I think that separates Washington's statement here, and to a certain degree the American experience, is that in America, our government has never treated the Jewish community as a single body, right? It tends to treat us as individual people, right? Our institutions that we create are wholly separate from government, right? They're not funded by government. They're not supported by government. Our synagogues are all nonprofits. They're all these separate corporations, right? In this country, we use the word nonprofits to describe these organizations. Most other countries use the phrase NGO, a non-governmental organization, right? Which means the same thing. The attitude that Washington brings is Jews are Americans who happen to practice Judaism. What we see in Napoleon is that the Jews are a body within my sovereignty that I have to deal with as a single body. And that attitude, I think, is also what separates the Jewish experience in America versus the Jewish experience in other places as well. And that when it seems like a government authority or a politician or anyone tries to treat Jews in this country as a single monolith, it rubs everybody the wrong way. Right? It's automatically assumed to be playing in anti-Semitism if you assume that the Jews have a single voice, right, or have a single opinion, or should be treated in the same way. And I think that's well-founded, right? It bothers me, for example, that we talk about the Jewish vote in elections, right? Because there's so few of us, right? And the notion that we have some sort of outsized influence plays into this notion that there is this vast conspiracy made up of Jews all over the world who are trying to do X, Y, and Z. In other countries, in other points in history, it was more allowable to talk that way. And I think in this country, it's been less so. You don't see necessarily, I mean, there are examples of it, and we'll talk about in the Civil War, how someone like General Grant tried to treat the Jews as a single body. Didn't go over well. It didn't go over well. Or we could say we like to have our cake and eat it too, right? We want to be treated as a group when we're looking for some kind of collective protection, like our freedom to worship in the way that we want, or the freedom from being forced into prayer in schools. But I want the government to see me, Greg, as the individual person, and see me as an individual citizen first and a Jewish person second. And maybe that's the brilliance of America, is that we play with that tension all the time. Last questions or comments before we wrap for the week. Alan, go ahead.
Thanks very much. As a major in history, I really appreciate that you looked at original documents. They're really good. Secondly, and this is a sort of an announcement, after you started the program, and I'm sure you're not aware of it, the Supreme Court just ruled 5-4 in favor, against Trump and again in favor of the DACA, saying that DACA has to continue. Now, no one's had a chance to read the decision yet, but Roberts joined the liberal group, and so it was a 5-4 decision. But it's not, they can refine, who knows what's going to happen, but it is an interesting week that we've had.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Brian.
Yeah, and to feed into this, because next Wednesday, I think it is, you're going to have the thing on the understanding that to collect all people of color in one group is very, very similar to this kind of approach, because this is what has always happened.
Yep. Yeah, Tuesday night. Bobby, are you saying something? Your mouth is moving, but your microphone is off. Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody. I will see you next Thursday morning, hopefully 10 a.m. We will look at, we'll move into the Civil War period and look at the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and the Jewish community and General Grant and the Jewish community, and also some Confederate stuff as well.
Thank you. I like your virtual background.
Thank you. Not my photo, but I'll use it. Bye, everybody. Thank you to Ross Lincoln House again for producing today as well. He's always good.